We can't allow the Department of Justice to become weaponized by a president who is petulant and has an enemies list. I mean, this takes us back in time to Richard Nixon and others who, given the abuse, given the opportunity to abuse their power, they did.
It is beyond Nixon, yes. It's Nixon on stilts and steroids.
It's a page out of Richard Nixon's book, right?
Welcome back with me now, MSNBC Chief Legal Correspondent and host of The Beat, Ari Melber, and Jill Wine-Banks, who served as an Assistant Special Prosecutor during Watergate and is, of course, a MSNBC legal analyst. Ari, Nixonian gets thrown around a lot this town. We give a gate to everything on this. But the most remarkable thing I think we're learning about the Trump Justice Department years is that the only difference between what John Mitchell and Nixon did, and I guess what Trump tried to do, is Trump did it in plain sight. We're finding everything out much faster rather than leaks to a couple of reporters. Is that the best way to look at this?
And that's exactly right, Chuck. And as you say, because we are all human beings and we respond to stories, the fact that it wasn't some single reveal like those secret tapes may change the way people look at this. But substantively, it doesn't make a darn difference. It's as bad or worse. It was demanded on Twitter. We now know that people like Congressman Schiff were at least swept up in this surveillance. As you and your guests were discussing in the previous segment, more investigation needs to be done to get all the details. But Schiff was the same person being called out in literally hundreds of public tweets. And so these requests basically got their result. More investigation needed to know if people literally met at the Justice Department and said, let's respond to the tweet or let's find a backdoor in. But he got what he wanted.
You know, Jill, we learned from Watergate what Nixon tried to do at the time. And in many cases, we learned this because there ended up being a special prosecutor. Right now, we're learning more of this because essentially I think you have some people unloading material. We're learning more. There's more disclosures. Obviously some gag orders have been lifted when it comes to subpoenas that Apple was able to tell us about. But that is my concern here. We don't have a special prosecutor right now that's trying to go through all of this. We're sort of at the, I guess we're just, hoping more people disclose stuff so we can figure out what happened. How concerned are you that we're not going to know everything?
I don't think we're going to know everything, at least not right away. I suspect there are going to be many more revelations of wrongdoing because the way the White House worked under the Trump administration is one where you had a lot of wrongdoing happening. And you're right when you say that it was done openly, and so people didn't always identify it. But not all of it was done openly. Some of it was secret, and some of it was under gag order. So a lot of that is going to come forward very quickly. I do think that you're right, that a special prosecutor would be a good idea, or at least a select committee within the Congress to actually go after this in the way that the Ervin Committee went after the evidence in Watergate, and Archibald Cox and Leon Jaworski went after it in the special prosecution. And there's no substitute for prosecution for accountability. That's what we need here so that we don't have a repetition.
Let's dig into these sort of Nixon-Trump comparisons. Is Don McGahn John Dean, Ari?
No, I think John Dean was both more pulled into the plot, which was why he was so vulnerable, and then flipped in a more dramatic fashion. We're looking now, of course, at the iconic public testimony. And because he was willing to put his neck on the line publicly, with the self-interest also involved, it was more powerful and useful. I mean, people interview John Bolton these days. You have, Chuck, I believe, but it's late. It wasn't when they wanted it in pursuant to the impeachment proceeding. Mr. McGahn went into private testimony, so he complied legally, but we never got that public video. That was part of the negotiations with the recent House testimony. And so in ways both stylistic and substantive, I think McGahn cuts a figure of much more historical complexity. He did ultimately cooperate. Of course, that's the bare minimum in law with Mueller. He did resist those demands, as you were discussing earlier in the show. What does it mean when people do that for a mix of patriotism and self-interest? But he also went along for a lot of this ride.
Jill, Bill Barr, John Mitchell.
Let me first say that I agree with Ari on the comparison. Dean lost his job before he cooperated. McGahn somehow managed to keep his, and he also never has fully divulged what he knows, I don't think, and his public testimony was only very limited. As to Barr and Mitchell, Mitchell went to jail for what he did. And I think that there is some chance that if we fully investigate what happened during the Barr administration at the Department of Justice, that he too will either be disbarred or he could end up with felony charges. He seems to me to have been clearly involved in cover-up, starting with his audition memo to get the job and his total mismanagement of the release of the Mueller report and his characterization of it before it was released in a way that said, no obstruction, no nothing here, no collusion. And, it's very hard to change first impressions. That sold before it got released. And we saw that there was obstruction clearly shown in the Mueller report. So I think he's done a very bad job, and that Merrick Garland has a really hard job in trying to remake the Department of Justice and get Americans to trust our system of justice again, and to get the people within the Department of Justice to trust that they can do an honest job and do justice without fear or favor. So I think he's got a really, really tough job, as did Edward Levy. And I think the two were picked for the same reasons. They are very credible people.
All right, Barr fascinates me, right? It fascinates me when he chose to resign, and I understand Joe's point. I think Barr might argue, hey, he's the executive. He can call the shots here. Does Barr think that anything he did was illegal, right? That in the, going back to Barr's theory of executive power here, Trump ultimately is the Justice Department.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I think you're giving it its maximal intellectual benefit of the doubt.
A little generous there, I admit, but I'm playing devil's advocate. Go ahead.
Yeah, as devil's advocate, as a theoretical device of how we think about this, but I do agree with what you're gesturing at, which is there's certainly a difference between, and we see this in corporate cases, between a general counsel who decides to just become a criminal, which is worse given their deep knowledge of where the lines are with regard to their intent, and someone who continues to skirt up to the end, even if critics and many former DOJ veterans on both parties said that they viewed him as going over the line and should be out of the office. And so I think he was very careful throughout. If you look, for example, at the infamous Barr letter that we've discussed, it was misleading. A judge has castigated it. It was, by any stretch of law school standard, very bad lawyering. But I'm not familiar with many experts saying that all of that forms a crime or forms a Mitchell-level conspiracy. And so that's where he is. I also think for Trump fans who exist, they lost the election, but they exist in large numbers. Bill Barr is the example of what they wanted out of the government, this whole concept of people who, as you said, are more loyal to the executive, whether that's Trump or a future strong man, strong woman type figure. But someone who really backs up the executive at all costs because they see what has traditionally been set up as guardrails and nonpartisan independence. They see as quote unquote deep state. They may be wrong about that, but that's where Barr also has almost a Cheney-esque, the original one, a Dick Cheney-esque quality of having fans within the Republican Party.
Well, again, I'm just fascinated on why he exited. Did he exit, or was he asked to exit? Ari Melber, Jill Wine-Banks, thank you both for being part of this special Meet the Press daily look at what we are calling democracy's near-death experience during the final days of the Trump administration. Up next, cases of the Delta variant are on the rise. We're live in one community where vaccinations are low, and sadly the variant is spreading fast. And later, we heard from both a Democrat and a Republican on this show yesterday who sure made it seem like a bipartisan infrastructure deal was possible. Today, I'll speak to a Democrat and a Republican together who just got more details about that plan.